And now please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I can see the scene now. An old man is sitting by the fire with his grandson on his knee. The wood is crackling before them. In the light of the fire, the old man opens up a well-worn copy of the Bible. "Now, where were we?" the old man asked his grandson. "We were reading the story of Jacob and how he tricked his brother into giving him the blessing." "Ah, yes," the old man replies, smiling. He turns to Genesis 28. Esau has threatened Jacob's life if he remained with his family, so Rebekah arranges for Jacob to flee and head back to her family's land in Haran. There, Jacob will find his wife. So Jacob heads off to a distant land, all alone and afraid. Needing a place to lay his head, Jacob uses a stone that was lying nearby. As he drifts off to sleep, Jacob has a dream. He sees a ladder stretching up to heaven with angels coming up and down. Then a truly remarkable thing happens. God himself appears above the ladder. Jacob is gripped with fear. What could this mean? But then God speaks. The words Jacob hears aren't judgment, but a blessing, a profound promise. It's the same blessing that God had given to Isaac, his father, and to Abraham before that. God tells Jacob that the promised land would be for him and his descendants, who would be as numerous as the dust of the earth. Even though Jacob is journeying to faraway Haran, God would bring him back and would always be with him. When Jacob awakes, he is shaken by the powerful and awe-inspiring vision that he had. Looking around, he utters the words, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. To mark the incredible vision, he sets up a stone and names the spot Bethel, which means house of God. The old man can see the fascination and wonder on his grandson's face. That blessing has been with our people since the time of Jacob. Even though we have been through many trials, we know that God is with us. Remember that. Don't ever forget it. What a tale. You can see why this story has had such resonance for Jews and Christians for thousands of years. You have the drama of the struggle between Jacob and Esau. I mean, who's had a brother has not had struggles among siblings? You have this family tension that leads to a great journey across the desert. Dream sequences have their own allure. Then there's the notion of a sacred place, of marking spots where profound spiritual experiences happen. Jacob is also embarking on his own version of the archetypal hero's journey, and this is his first stop. But what intrigues me most about this text is how I framed it above, how the story is told and passed down, and the power that that has. Because its retelling, because of its retelling, this story has nurtured essential aspects of the narrative of Israel's identity. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are known as the primeval history. Even the Roman Catholic Church, way back in the 1950s, said that the first 11 chapters of Genesis were not history, but the genre of myth. These stories do not capture what happened historically. Rather, they were mythological tales that were told, as in the way they were told in our story with the grandson and the old man, throughout the generations, and they shaped the identity of Israel. And it is in that context where we can see the true power of this story, the way in which it's retold and the power of this narrative. Here we have the message that the Israelites are the chosen people of God. God has selected Jacob and his descendants and given them a special blessing. They will multiply and be fruitful and fill the earth, and they have a land, a particular land that God gave them and their descendants. Now, if you think this narrative this mythological narrative doesn't have power? Just look at present-day Israel and the conflict over the West Bank. Conservative Jews maintain the belief that ancient Palestine, which includes the West Bank, was given to them by God. They therefore continue to build settlements in the West Bank to claim that to claim that land even though it provokes continued conflict with the Palestinians. Conservative Jews adamantly oppose a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine to coexist because it goes against this promise, stated in Genesis 28 and elsewhere in those first 11 chapters of Genesis. When I was at Harvard, I studied history. Back then, the first class they required of every history major was called History 97. In History 97, we learned that history as a discipline was far more than just retelling what happened. At any moment of time, an innumerable number of different things happen. And when you tell the story of a particular event, you have to pick and choose the details that matter most to explain the course of history. In History 97, we were first given a series of documents and told to write a narrative history of the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So how do you write that history? Which details do you highlight and why? What's your argument? Then we had to write an intellectual history of the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. How did the thinking about the Second Amendment evolve over time? Different people tell that story in different ways. We had to write a biography by looking at the leader of the Taiping Rebellion in China in the 19th century, and then a sociological history that looked at the power of social movements. For each of these research papers, we had to wrestle with how historians use facts to interpret a particular event, and how different historians shape the story to make an argument. Histories of the same event can be told in different ways, and how that story is told and repeated matters. Now, what is true of academic history is even more true of our own personal histories. When I was in divinity school, we studied what is known as narrative theology. Human beings are fundamentally meaning makers. We piece together the events of our own lives to create various narratives of ourselves. These narratives are crucial for our own identity, just as the narrative of Genesis 28 was crucial for the self-identity of Israel. These narratives mold our actions. So let's say you see yourself as a kind person and a generous person. That's a narrative you have in your head, and you might point to different times in your life where you acted kindly towards those around you, especially those times where showing kindness was difficult. You remind yourself when you've given generously to those in need. And then when you wrestle with those times when you've been not so kind, you put them into a coherent narrative that can justify them. Oh, I was not kind at that time because I was going through a difficult patch at work or in my family life. It's not who I am. It's not the story I tell about myself. I fixed that. I'm more compassionate now. Nevertheless, if you ask someone else who knows you, they might very well tell the narrative of your life in a different way. Do you see how important narrative can be, these narratives can be, how they shape us? If you see yourself as a kind person, if you've created that narrative about yourself, you're much more likely to be kind because you want to fulfill that own narrative and make it true. If you've created an identity as someone who succeeds in life, you're a winner, right? You'll push yourself to make sure that identity comes true. If you don't succeed, you create a narrative that justifies that so you can maintain that identity. When I was a senior in high school, I was the captain of the wrestling team. At the big end-of-the-year tournament, the Graves Kelsey, I found myself losing to my first-round opponent deep in the third period. With 30 seconds to go, I had to make up a 3-point deficit, which, if you know something about wrestling, is actually quite a bit with 30 seconds to go. And I remember walking to the center of the mat after being pushed out of bounds and thinking to myself, I am the captain of this team, and I will not go out of the tournament in the first round. I will not end my wrestling career like this to this wrestler from Middlesex. Somehow, I found within myself an extra level of focus and strength. The whistle blew, and I reversed my opponent before flipping him onto his back. Just as the buzzer sounded, I had somehow earned 5 points and won the match. And I remember walking off the mat and my coach saying, well, it took you long enough. Many years ago, before I entered divinity school, I was briefly a liquor salesman for a vodka company. It's a long story how I ended up there, but it's another story for another time. One day I was driving along with my boss, the regional salesman, Bill Walsh, known as Billy Boru, after the vodka we were selling, Boru Vodka. Cruising along Route 128, Billy had the driver's side window of his Lincoln rolled down as he chain-smoked Marlboros and talked between drags. Like most salesmen, he was a great storyteller, and Billy had some absolutely crazy stories. But at one point, I asked him about his family, and Billy said that he had a daughter who was in high school. And I inquired about her plans for college. Billy shrugged his shoulders. That was up to her, he said. But I'm certainly not paying for it, he added. I had to pay my own way, and so she's got to do that as well. Now, having grown up in a place like Wellesley, I could not wrap my head around a father who would not work his hardest to provide the best education for his child. But Billy had a very different narrative in his head about what constituted being a good father. He wanted his daughter to be independent. He wanted her to earn her own way. That's what being a good father meant to him. One remarkable thing is that these narratives that shape our identity, these narratives can extend beyond our own lives. Just look at the allure of genealogy. You research your own ancestors to find more about your own story and then choose the details that matter most to you in its retelling. Let's say your ancestors came over on the Mayflower or fought in the American Revolution. That might give you pride in your deep American roots and increased ownership over certain aspects of the American story. Others look at their immigrant past to highlight the perseverance that might be within them, or to travel to those places to incorporate elements of that nation's identity into their own self-story, self-narrative. And of course, these narratives of our ethnic and cultural identities that we tell ourselves can also have their dark side. Adolf Hitler knew this and used it to great effect in 1930s Germany, as did many whites in the Jim Crow South. I'm particularly interested in how this awareness of our ancestors can affect our spiritual self-identity. For instance, I know a number of African American Christians who have researched African religions to inspire their own spirituality. That becomes a part of their spiritual narrative. They look at the importance of rhythm in both song and speech, and an appreciation of the power of the Holy Spirit and ecstatic religious experiences. They use their narratives to shape that experience of their faith. Others that I know look to Celtic Christianity and the tradition of the Druids to see the spiritual forces that are apparent in nature. The same thing holds true for those with Native American roots, who incorporate indigenous spiritual practices into their own brand of Christianity. So what about you? What are the narratives about yourself that matter most to you? How would you describe yourself to someone else? Better yet, if you were to tell your own life story, what would be those Jacob's Ladder incidents, those Jacob's Ladder stories, those touch points you come back to? What are the moments you highlight that give the best impression of who you really are, or at least who you perceive yourself to be? For me, I might tell what it was like to grow up in Wellesley for me. I loved learning, and I would read the World Book Encyclopedia in my free time. There I'd be in our den with the crimson-colored book resting on my knees while I memorized random details about past US presidents. I also loved playing with my Legos or making up Dungeons & Dragons scenarios on my own. Yes, on my own, playing all the different characters. I used anything that could spark my imagination. I loved that. I've always been intellectually and spiritually curious. So what shaped you? And before you answer that, there's one thing you have to consider, is that we each have many narratives within us. We contain multitudes, as Whitman would say. So what are the narratives that matter most to you? What stories, what Jacob's Ladder incidences would you report first? And if you have kids, what stories have you told them about yourself and your family? Now, since we're in church, I wonder about God's role in your own personal story. If there's one thing we're not good at in the Northeast, it is telling our stories about God. Now, those experiences are there within you. After all, you're here in church in the summertime. But we tell them even to ourselves, these stories of God in our lives so infrequently. And yet it's in the repeating of the stories that they become internalized as a part of our identity and the identities of our children. Again, I think back to the story of Genesis 28 being told again and again to children over generations, and how that shapes their self-identity and their self-perception of God working in the world and in their lives. Now, I'm lucky in this regard because I'm a minister, and so I'm expected to tell stories about God in my life. I get the opportunity to repeat them again and again. I talk about the importance of receiving my third grade Bible here on these steps, actually before the renovation steps, but they're similar enough. And the impact of reading that Bible on me. Late night in 7th grade, I would turn on the light next to my bed and read that tiny print in the Gospel of Matthew. I've often mentioned the power of worship services here as a kid, particularly on Easter and Christmas. They sparked my imagination and my wonder about God, even as a little child. When I would sit back there, roughly where Elizabeth and Matt are, that's where we always sat as a family. When we sat back there, I remember squinting my eyes and then looking at the large gold cross that was above the altar table until the light from the cross would be reflected in my eyelids when I closed them. Now, I could go on and on, but I'm more curious about you. When was the last time you told your experiences of God, of your feeling of God's blessing and presence, like in the Jacob story for this morning? Because I want you to tell those stories. I want you to tell me about them, and I want you to tell your children and grandchildren about them. Those personal testimonies, those personal stories shape people. They shape people's identities, self-perception. One of the great gifts of the Bible are the incredible stories that it contains. The book of Genesis has some of the most memorable stories in the entire Bible. Tales like that of Jacob's ladder have shaped the self-identity of Israel as the chosen people, and also of Christians as inheritors of that legacy. And when we tell these stories, they become a part of our own narrative of the faith. They shape our identities and those of our children. What stories matter most for you and your family? What stories have been told again and again that have become a part of your own family mythology and self-identity? Can you feel the boldness and freedom to talk more about God's role in that life and narrative? Like of Jacob's ladder, these stories of faith will give you a solid ground on which to build your continued growth in your beliefs. They have the potential to immensely enrich the way in which you interact with the world, but you have to tell them to yourself and to others. Tell them and keep telling them, and notice how your perspective on the world begins to shift. I've long nurtured my own imagination, and the older I get, the more I want to nurture that. It's incredible to see how God's presence enlarges that imagination and creates a world that's pregnant with possibilities when God is there present within it. The past is not something locked in the days behind us. When the past is told, it opens up a new future. So what would that future hold for you?